A very good afternoon. You're tuned into the Sunday Business Wrap with me, Ntokozo Khumalo. And with most people now back at your business is also in full swing. And 2024 is certainly a significant year with more than 2 billion people across more than 50 countries set to hit the polls, which is something that we haven't quite seen in history before, because that's nearly half of the world's population deciding on new governments. And this will surely play a role in the geopolitical landscape globally. And of course, 2024 is an election year right here in South Africa. The ANC celebrating its 112th anniversary at the Bombela Stadium in Mpumalanga yesterday. President Cyril Ramaphosa delivering the ruling party's January 8th statement. Is this a hit or a miss? Or, as the analyst that I spoke to said, good plans with very little action. Isabel Fryer, the Executive Director for Social Policy Initiative, will join us in studio for that conversation. But, of course, the elections are not just important for the citizens of the country, but the eyes of the world will be watching as well. And South Africa will be putting its best foot forward as the richest, most powerful and influential gather in Davos, that's Switzerland, for the World Economic Forum that's kicking off tomorrow, the 15th of January. And South Africa, of course, we heard from Finance Minister there, Godongwana, saying that he's confident South Africa will be able to attract that investment as well as growth partners. But with the country in the middle of a few geopolitical tangles over the last year, and the country's biggest trade partner, and that's of course China's economy continuing to slow, how easy will that be? And China is also now accused of possibly triggering a new trade war and raising trade tensions by shifting towards high-value manufacturing. So we'll have a conversation there with Professor Paul Dembe, who is the founder and director at Cell Advisory, and he'll be with us to have that discussion. But before we take a look at all of that, let's take a look at some economic news that made headlines this week.
Think tank BMI believes South Africa has fulfilled its obligations to obtain better trade terms under the African Growth and Opportunity Act. The Fitch research firm says there is a 65% chance that AGOA will be renewed and altered to benefit the country's exports. It said a 10 to 20-year renewal period is possible after the country decided not to welcome Russia's President Vladimir Putin to the BRICS conference, leading to reduced political tensions. It does warn, however, that AGOA's future may be doomed should Trump win the presidency later this year. Foreign exchange reserves for December came in higher than the month before at $62.5 billion, with increases seen in foreign currency and gold reserves. South Africa's foreign exchange reserves have come under the spotlight as the cost of borrowing soars and a fiscal crisis looms, leaving the country desperate for new sources of cash. The wheels of justice in the state capture case turned again this week after SAP agreed to pay just over $220 million, nearly 4.1 billion in rands. It reached a civil settlement with the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission for similar bribery charges in Indonesia, Tanzania, Malawi, Kenya, Ghana, and Azerbaijan. The company entered a 3-year deferred prosecution agreement with U.S. authorities and will cooperate with authorities there and here at home to ensure the prosecution of guilty individuals. The Black Business Council's CEO, Hanki Matabane, says the settlement received by South Africa should go towards establishing a whistleblowers fund to protect those who expose similar graft.
Well, on Saturday, the African National Congress celebrated its 112th anniversary, and that was at the Bombela Stadium in Mpumalanga. The Executive Director at the Social Policy Initiative, Isabel Fryer, is in studio with us now for a discussion around the ruling party's January 8th statements and its economic policies. Isabel, thank you so much for chatting to us this Sunday afternoon. Quite a busy Saturday it was for ANC members as President Cyril Ramaphosa, of course, laid out the party's January 8th statement. I took a listen to it and I'd done a preview on what we're likely to hear. Similar action plans. And I don't want to say it's the same action plans because we understand that it takes a while to get economic policy going. But talk us through your thoughts of this year's January 8th.
Thank you. And again, thanks so much for the opportunity and invitation. I have to say that January 8th is historically a really important time for the ANC to set forward as the ruling party, but as the liberation movement as well, its plan for the year. So it comes, of course, before and ahead of SONA and the budget, which are two nationally important dates. For an election year, I think that the contents of this year's January 8th was incredibly disappointing. It's as if it didn't start to unfold. I mean, if you just take the opening statement, which was instead of having a program of action for this election year, the ruling party decided to take last year's 6 points and work on them. Now, as you say, of course, you can't achieve a universe in 1 year. But to not say this is the election year, this is what we're going to celebrate, this is what we're going to do, and given the huge geopolitical shift that had happened, this is where we're going to go. The January 8th statement really should be the foundation for the election manifesto that's going to come out next month. But we saw nothing of that. The ANC did not take its membership, let alone the nation, into its confidence and say, this is why we're the confident party, this is what we've achieved, and this is how we can do more if you vote for us.
And I feel like, if anything, those points kind of depressed you a little bit, because it's like it's the same points that we were dealing with 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. What are the issues, Isabel? Because some of the economists and analysts that I spoke to in the week are saying that it's not that ANC policies are necessarily bad or terrible. Some of them are really good ideas and plans, but the issue is implementation. Do you share those sentiments?
It's difficult to sometimes see where one begins and the other ends. So we know that implementation hasn't occurred, so I think I would agree on that. But if you look at the main points, which is economic growth, I was looking at last year's January 8th and then back to 2019. In 2019, we were looking at agriculture, tourism and mining being the 3 points which were going to grow the economy. Then, of course, we had COVID, which hit tourism out the sector. But we don't see the industrial manufacturing renewal that we keep on getting told about. So this year, one of the main points that they run with is beneficiation. Now, we've been told beneficiation because, of course, one of the curses of the SADC region is that we are rich in minerals, but we don't beneficiate, so we don't create jobs, we don't benefit from the value add here that gets exported, we import that. So we know that. But what do you need for beneficiation of minerals? Smelting. You need electricity, you need energy, and you need effective rail and ports. Now, we don't have either of those. So, in effect, what we're doing is putting up empty promises, and there's nothing substantive. There is a whole lot, I think, that we should have picked up on, that could be celebrated.
Tell us about that. What do you think the party should be focusing on? Because even with the economic policies over the years, there'll be changes, and it's stagnant for a while. What do you think the ruling party should be focusing on that will get the economy on the right track?
So I've got to answer that by sort of referencing a bad news story, and that's unemployment. Now, I think we often talk about unemployment and shrug it off like we do poverty and inequality, but we need to contextualize it. Unemployment in South Africa has the highest unemployment in the world. The country that comes after us is Djibouti, which is an arid, conflict-ridden desert country of under 1 million people. And so we have a massive unemployment problem. A paper that Spy is releasing this week, written by Duma Kabule, refers to this as akin to a war effort. We need to actually be taking stops out. Now, if you look at the January 8th statement, we get told that 5.7 million youth between the ages of 15 and 34 are employed, and that's true. What they don't say is that 6.7 million are unemployed. We also talk about the fact that 300,000 jobs, or the ANC talks about the fact that 300,000 jobs have been created. What they don't say is that each year, 800,000 people enter the labour market that need to be absorbed. So the question is, what do we do to absorb people? And from the research that we've done, really what we need to be doing is redistributing income. We need a universal basic income, which means that everybody has access to income and becomes an economic actor, and then you have a demand up from the bottom up, which will look at industrial supply, it will look at manufacturing, and it will also ensure that people have enough, that the taxes generated from an increase in expenditure will go straight to the state coffers. And so what we'll do is we'll start generating the levels of GDP growth that will justify additional spending, which would then, in effect, keep that a positive loop. That is the one positive story which we didn't see. We didn't see that at the beginning of the January 8th, the President said, referred to the social relief of distress grant, but it didn't come anywhere again in the whole looking at poverty, unemployment and inequality. That is the good news story. That is the story that South Africa is able to extend to more people than any other country in Africa, social security. We're the most unequal country, so we need to be leveling out. There is such opportunity if you then introduce microeconomic policies that are linked to a cash redistribution of sufficient level to start generating that. We can't create jobs for 11.7 million people. It is not possible. But we can ensure that everybody has the opportunity to run their own livelihood, to start uplifting their community, and so have that generation. That's the kind of innovation that we need. But instead we're trapped in a neoliberal economic policy which says we have to look at debt and inflation. If we look at debt, if we just look at debt, South Africa's debt is 75% of GDP. The global equivalent is 93%, the average. So we're not that high. But the reason why there is a constraint on borrowing is because we don't have GDP growth. But if we're not borrowing, we are not able to stimulate and have the stimulus to have the growth. So we're actually slowly shrinking. And at the same time, more people are having their needs unmet. We have an election year, as I started off by saying, where are the policies that say, we see people. Instead, we see politicians who are looking for positions frequently, instead of saying these are the policies that will transform. And it's not just, I know we're talking about the January 8th statement, but I mean, one of the things that I'm going to be doing this year is a podcast just looking at each of the electoral parties and what their promises are, because I have not been overwhelmed by any. Yeah,
very underwhelming. And there seems to be a disconnect, Isabel, perhaps as a final question, to talk us through just the socio-economic makeup that we're in South Africa. You know, President Cyril Ramaphosa really highlighting what the party has done in the country over the last 30 years. And I think a question that has also been there is how long, perhaps, until we get a new benchmark to the growth that we are seeing as a country away from apartheid. Perhaps you could touch on that, but perhaps also looking at just the socio-economic issues and on a global landscape, as you said, you know, the shifting geopolitical issues that we're facing, where South Africa often finds itself in the middle of it. How do we then navigate those spaces, and what are some opportunities that if we strike while the iron is hot, we could actually then see some of that growth out of them?
I mean, as you say, the entire landscape to an extent is determined by exogenous factors. So we had the Ukrainian war 2 years ago. We now have the Palestinian war by Israel on Palestine. And that, of course, affects, in addition to the tragedies, the human tragedies in those stories, for South Africans, it affects the oil price, and we also start importing inflation on food production. So we are captured, we're prisoners of that. We can't get out of it. But I think that if we were to look at the Southern African region, as we were discussing off camera, this year we have elections in South Africa, in Namibia, Botswana and Mozambique. So there's a lot of change. The question is, once the new governments come into being, are there ways in which we can benefit? We've got the Africa Free Trade Continent Agreement. How do we use that to benefit ourselves if the other traditional markets are being closed because logistics and transport? But I mean, one of the interesting facts is that right now there's an American-backed plan to build a big port in Namibia to export from DRC. At the same time, the Chinese are backing the development of a rail and port through Mozambique. Now, how does South Africa feature there? There's a huge amount that can be done, but what we need to be doing is recognize 2 or 3 main points that we can do nationally. So I would say, without apology and hesitation, roll out UBI, Universal Basic Income, start looking at taxation around that. In addition to that, we need to make sure that there is sufficient food, and I would also say that the infrastructure projects which have been working quite well, get those done, and that includes Eskom, of course, because if we don't have the energy, we can't. But also then start negotiating conditional or trade beneficial deals with our neighbours. What kinds of levels of food production are required? What kinds of mining commodities? I mean, a lot of the minerals that the rest of the world is looking for, we have within our region. But we need to make sure that that Transnet comes to the party, that basically we're able to operate as an equal partner, not one limping behind. And so we can start dictating some of those. But those are ways in which we can get people into jobs once we've made sure that their basic needs are met. So there is a sequencing that needs to be sorted out, and we don't see that. We've got 5 years in the new administration, meet people's basic needs, create the jobs, but also make sure that we take back our role within the sub-region, so we don't have superpowers coming in and dictating the terms. And once again, a kind of neo-colonialism coming in, where our goods are taken out, our labour is being extracted, and we don't benefit.
Isabel, thank you so much. So insightful, and time really flies when you're getting that info. And of course, that is Isabel Fryer, who is the Executive Director for the Social Policy Initiative. And welcome back. While Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana believes the case South Africa has brought against Israel's onslaught on Palestine will not be used against the country's delegation at the World Economic Forum this coming week. Now, Godongwana will lead Team South Africa amid a hotly contested legal battle to have Israel military action in Palestine deemed a genocide. Now, at the International Court of Justice, that's Xolani Mbajwa, our business editor, does have more details on that. Take a look.
Enoch Godongwana says South Africa will have one major objective at the World Economic Forum in Davos next week, and that is to attract investment to Africa's most industrialized nation. And Godongwana doesn't believe South Africa's case at the International Court of Justice may influence investors or how South Africa's delegation is perceived.
Insofar as the court case is concerned, I do not know why people would have an attitude to a country that uses multilateral institutions for settling disputes. Because those multilateral institutions have been set up by the United Nations for dispute settlement. Why then would it be seen to utilize that dispute settlement mechanism? In this case, the court case South Africa has chosen. I don't see anybody likely to making this as an issue in Davos.
Godongwana also says the South African team, made up of captains of industry and ministers, will not shy away from the challenges the country faces, including load shedding, crime, corruption, and logistic bottlenecks.
The key is investment. The investment, with it comes growth. With growth, I get better revenues. That's our key focus, is to how do we go to that part of the world with that kind of platform, sell South Africa, and argue a better case for our country.
Electricity Minister Dr. Hosienzo Ramokgopa says among the priorities at WEF will be to garner investments for the National Transmission Company of South Africa, which has become the first of Eskom's 3 divisions to achieve legal separation.
Part of the conversations we'll be taking up at Davos is to ensure that we are able to communicate with the potential private sector players to say that this is the route that we are taking for purposes of financing transmission and getting to have a sense or a gauge of their appetite to invest in that space. And of course, we'll come back to say this is the model that we'll be using to be able to accommodate private sector participation.
JSE CEO Dr. Leila Fourie has dismissed assertions that South Africa's capital markets are not as attractive as they used to be after a record number of companies delisted since 2020.
The concept of delistings in the public market is a global phenomenon. It's not peculiar only to South Africa. And in fact, South Africa has fared a lot better than many of their developed world counterparts. If we look at the stats between 2010 and 2022, Luxembourg Stock Exchange was down by 56%. Deutsche Börse was down by 36%. The London Stock Exchange was down by 33%, and the JSE was down by 23%. If we look at the market cap, which is really a very good indication of the value that is available for trade, 30 years ago, the JSE's market cap was 800 billion rand. It's now 19 trillion rand.
Godongwana believes the theme for this year's annual meeting, Rebuilding Trust, is appropriate considering the complexity associated with the domestic and transnational headwinds. He says the theme also speaks broadly about the priorities for this year, including achieving security and cooperation in a fractured world, creating growth and jobs, using artificial intelligence to drive safety and growth, and strategies around climate change and safety. For Newzroom Afrika on Channel 405, I'm Xolani Mbanjwa in Johannesburg.
Well, as we've just heard from Newzroom Africa's business editor, Xolani Mbanjwa, who, by the way, is in Davos for the World Economic Forum that's kicking off tomorrow. Minister Godongwana is optimistic that South Africa will make the right friends and partners at the forum. And this year, as geopolitical tensions rage on, WEF has consolidated its focus discussion areas from 21 seen last year to just 4 themes, with achieving security and cooperation in a fractured world as one of the key themes for the week. And to help us make a sense of the significance of WEF and South Africa's relationship with China in this fractured geopolitical climate is Professor Paul Tembe, who is the founder and director of Sele Encounters. Thank you so much for talking to us. And now, interestingly, as the pack was playing, you were saying South Africa quite big in us making those symbolic investments or putting our foot forward to attract FDI, but not quite a real game plan on what to do. Can you talk us through what exactly you mean by that?
Thank you for having me. What I'm saying that let's talk about China first before we go to the World Forum that's taking place now. China is a new kid in the block. So China doesn't have institutional memory in Africa, especially in South Africa. So China is hitting the ground running. So when a new partner moves with means of having the power of appeal, in the process, there are low fruits hanging in this courtship. And I guess that there are some bottlenecks that doesn't allow South Africa to access these low-hanging fruits. The first and primary bottleneck, for example, is the lack of public awareness between China and Africa. The people-to-people mechanism works, yes, but China still remains an enigma in the general populace. I think that is the first step which we have to solve. The second one is policy versus law. We've got lots of progressive policies that could work, that if implemented, then there will be solution. But most of these policies also, they are not in the book of law in South Africa. So that makes investors get jitters, including China. The other one is short-termism to long-termism. I know most people will question me on this one. That's what do I mean by short-term. I think for a nation that has been oppressed or that has been at the periphery of the international arena for more than 500, 300 years, depending on whom you're asking, the five-year democratic election and change of seat of government is too short to make amends with the traumas that the nation has gone through. And at the same time, that also disturbs the blueprint that is in place. And if the machine is to be driven only by policy without proclamation into the book of law, then that is a little bit cumbersome. We're working backwards. And this also plays to the notion that FDI is the solution for South Africa. We don't have a blueprint, a clear blueprint, an inclusive blueprint that will help us access the goods from the advantages that we are having in South Africa. South Africa is very big internationally. You see that when you travel all over the world, but we are not able to access those goods that are low-hanging fruits, both from our plurilateral partners like China, which our partnerships are very, very much diversified. We don't have tools to access those goods.
And let's talk a little bit about drawing those parallels, because in your latest book, you outline sort of just understanding those relations between South Africa and China. Yeah. And President Cyril Ramaphosa himself, in the week, did get a bit of backlash, drawing the parallels between South Africa and China. And I suppose saying that trauma of where we come from, being oppressed, could be that parallel. And he said, 100-year economic plan that China has. But is the difference not there that China actually then has that 100-year plan?
The issue here is parallels might end up at trauma only. Let us draw these parallels, just for interest's sake. What did China do in its first 29 years of inception of the People's Republic of China? It closed its doors. And it spoke to the Chinese people. And Chinese people had to know that China belongs to Chinese population. And they made means to industrialize China. But first, they had to take a disjuncture from the old feudalism geographies and feudalism systems, feudalism modes of production. In South Africa, we haven't taken that disjuncture in our first 30 years. Because if you count from 1949 to 1978, when opening up and reform, when China was ready to face the world, China was 29 years old. We are 30 years old. We have not taken that disjuncture, the abandonment of human geographies of apartheid, the abandonment of spatial geographies of apartheid, the abandonment of modes of production where the previous regime still has a room to play. So the parallel ends there in the trauma. If you're a swimmer, you put on a swimming suit and go into a swimming pool. Then a footballer cannot say, just because he's an athlete, say, I'll learn from that swimmer. I like this talk of, let us learn from China. Yeah. If you are to learn from China, what are the prerequisites of establishing a vast trickle-down effect? Because that's what happens in China. Yes. The funnel is upside down. The goods and investment, they get up here, then there's a popular trickle-down effect. Real GDP is visible in China and amongst the Chinese, in the sense that in 30 years, China has managed to quadruple the standard of living of its people. And an added factor is that one of the sustainable development goal of the United Nations, the first goal, eradication of poverty, China achieved that in 1921. That is 10 years before the mark in the world. So you have to ask yourself, for example, and say, can South Africa do that?
Can we do it, Prof, if we are still with the ruling party, the priority action plans or the priority action plans are the same ones we've seen over the last 15 years?
I've mentioned short-term, long-term policy and law, but then also there's a last bottleneck. This bottleneck also has, I can even term it as, our policies are not people-centered. Our policies still remain within the notion of the magic hand of capitalism, that the government shouldn't interfere. If we speak about traumas, it means there are those who are left by design at the periphery. So what are the means that take these who were at the periphery to the center? Not taking them for taking sake, but making them part and parcel of the system. We continue talking about the Bill of Rights. We continue talking about the old book of freedoms and democracy with its definitions that we have here in South Africa. And yet, when it comes to the crunch, we go to the new book, our new friend. If we count even in terms of dollars, there are billions of Chinese money that is supporting some projects in South Africa, whereby we would have failed from our old traditional friends. So there is another parallel with our old friends, and there's another parallel with our new friends. We cannot learn from China if our system of governance is not conducive into the manner in which Chinese produce knowledge, produce goods.
And when or how long do you think it would take for South Africa to sort of grow up and be an adult in its own right, being able to pick those right friends? As you're saying, we can't say we are looking to China, but not picking things like making policies people-centered, while we say we're trying to get rid of poverty. And with 2024 being such an important year globally, with all the elections taking place, where do we stand? And what's the step that, you know, the ruling party, but also the citizens of this country should take in terms of sort of standing up, knowing who, how to build those relationships that can grow the economy?
Unfortunately, without being condescending, our citizens have become spectators to the ongoings in South Africa for the last decade. Even the blueprints that were in place that you've spoken about, I don't see the reason why they have to change a name because there's a new incumbent. There's only one reason for that. It means it's getting rid of the former policies in order to enact new policies because of the incumbent. That is not a system. That is action by whim. So what we need, if I'm to be a little bit brutal, we need a reset button. And I really hope we could use 2024 with the watershed that is coming globally to press a reset button in South Africa. And it wouldn't even cause lots of damage, that reset button. I'll tell you why. We've got 3 wars going on. Ukraine, Russia, the second war, Hamas, Israel, with Hezbollah waiting in Lebanon. And we've got the 3rd war, and that is the most interesting war. America is at war with itself. And that is accompanied with 3 risks. The first risk is a partitioned Ukraine. That will have its own consequences as well. And then the second one is the Middle East that is at the brink. And who is the king or the queen in this chess game? Again, it is the American election, whether Democrats or Republicans win, that will have an impact. And remember that all of this happens at a time when we have not fully recovered from the pre-COVID supply chains, pre-COVID growth, job losses. So I think South Africa has got nothing to lose by hitting a reset button at this point in time. And it is a pity because, as you said at the beginning of the interview, South Africa is very good with symbolic investment. For example, let's take the case in point of the International Court of Justice. This is not the first time South Africa does something like this, but this one is magnitude. This is our speciality. Mandela Magic, from 1994 onwards, we're hitting above our weight. Conflict in Darfur, we're there to mediate. South Sudan and Sudan, we were there to mediate. Now we are going to DRC. Well, there are many views on that, but the fact is we are good in planting the seed of symbolic investment. And the best thing with symbolic investment is that you never know when you are going to harvest, but the input is always smaller then the output. Output can be huge. We see it now happening with China. Symbolic investment of China helped liberation movements. Symbolic investment of African countries in 1971 supported the PRC to be the sole representative of the Chinese people. That was the symbolic investment. So that is the likability of China and Africa. And thus I say, we as South Africa and perhaps the continent as a whole, we are not aware what China is ready to give. So let us go to President Xi Jinping's initiatives. Global Security Initiative, which is one of the themes in Davos. Global Development Initiative, one of the themes in Davos. Global Civilizational Initiative, which states that, as South Africa is doing, each and every nation in its civilization has got something to put in the international table. And South Africa is very good at that type of investment. But we don't have the pipeline to harvest. We don't have the pipeline to harvest. Davos is a very good opportunity for us because we have 100 governments represented there. We've got 1,000 partner enterprises or companies that are helping in Davos. Yes, we are going to make friends. But how do we then streamline those results and have a larger trickle-down effect? Because as long as we don't have a larger trickle-down effect in South Africa, the problem is going to be the following. The problem is going to be, yes, those people who are coming with the FDI and some local players, which are very small percentage, they are going to make profit for profit's sake. And we are here having this dialogue in order to see how can we make our society better.
The main question.
That's the main question.
So not make those relationships just for the sake of it, but to actually have a plan to see through that harvest. Professor, thank you so much for talking to us and giving us those insights. And of course, that's Professor Paul Tembe, who is the founder and director of Sile Encounters, that is a cross-civilization communication strategies and analytics platform that helps to streamline policies from Africa and China, Global South and Global North. Thank you for that conversation. It's time for a quick break, but before we do, let's take a look at other international news that made headlines in the week that was.